And no, I'm happy to be back doing this with you. So these are like therapeutic. So I can't
It's it's been a
honestly.
while.
It has. No, listen, stuff happens. Life gets in the way, and you never intend on having hiatuses like that, but
Nah. But you know
people.
what? I've just learned sometimes with the hiatuses, if it's something that you're passionate about doing, then you're gonna pick it back up. So it's never like a goodbye. It's always like I'm gonna talk to you later. We just don't know when. Our lives always take us into two different paths, and it is kind of funny. The last time we actually spoke face to face, you were here, where I
Mhm.
am right now. So
Yes.
I will say that we had a pretty decent buffer. But again, like you said, man, this is therapeutic. This is everything. Talking about sports is one thing, but talking about sports with somebody who understands the practicality behind it as well takes the excitement to a different level for me. It's more of like a passive, mellowed excitement because dialogue, for being new, it's important. You were a communications major. I majored in sport industry with a comm minor. So, we're pretty well versed on how it is for people, how it is for group settings, so on and so forth. So we have the conversational tact. And that's like the exciting part about this. Like, yeah, we only have a certain amount of time we could talk about podcasts, but if people wanted the off the cuff, unfiltered, we could go 6, 7 hours. Like the first day I moved in,
I
just like the
mean,
first day I moved in.
that's why I'm doing this lead in right now because I think it's a conversation, and the fact is it's a renewal of things, and there has been a gap. Oh, by the way, this is the Ethan and Nick Trash Boat podcast, and this has been a very long opening, but a very natural
Yeah.
one. Uh,
It's
just to
SNL. It's SNL code open.
just to get the formalities out there. I'm Ethan Finkelstein at I am Finkelstein on Twitter. That's my co-host Nick Graves at Nickstape15 on Twitter, and I actually did not change my name on here ahead of time. So, oh well. Looks like we're gonna go ahead and just keep it
Not a
that
big
way for
deal.
this episode, and I'll put my Twitter handle below. So,
Not a big deal, man. Not a big deal.
yeah,
This was saved from another conversation that I had with a group of other people, and we were told to put our Twitter names as our, screen names. So I was like, okay. So not
that's
a big
fair.
deal.
No, I
Not
mean
a big deal.
it's smart. I mean, the fact is I've gotten in trouble because I actually ended up having my name, believe it or not, as something completely different during an office meeting. I was logged into yeah, I was logged into Zoom, and I flat out changed my name as a joke, a reference to. Do you remember our what's it called our Zoom groups for Jackbox, and one of the people in there, Ben, he has Gel Spice Compliance Manager or Gel Spice Manager, and I had mine as Ethan Gel Spice Manager when I went into my
Not
into
that bad.
my Zoom meeting, and I didn't realize it until like 5 minutes in, and then I was like, oh crap. And then I changed it. And then after the meeting, my colleague, Mike, who's wonderful, by the way, one of the best coworkers I've ever had, maybe the best, like, full time, like, adult, like, job coworker I've ever had, was just like, he called me, he's like, hey, Ethan, I didn't know if you were aware of this. I didn't want to bring it up in front of David, but like, your name was different today on Zoom. It was Ethan Gel Spice Manager. You're aware of that? I'm like, yeah, no, I caught it, but when we already were 5 minutes in, so I'm sure either he saw it and didn't care, or he didn't notice it, but he never said anything to me. So it is what it is. But I always like freak out when we do those things because I'll change my name to something, and sometimes it's like not a PC name, and I have to make sure
Right.
not to click remember my name.
See, and that's a perfect segue of it is what it is. More of a downtrodden version of it, but Simone Biles, man.
Yes.
Simone Biles pulling out
Yeah.
of multiple events at the Olympics and the understanding that she's doing this for herself, and it's not in a selfish sense, it's in a selfless sense. Her mental health is important. um I don't think it still registers to people, and I want you to chime in, interrupt, however best you want to. But I don't think people still get the concept that superstar athletes, no matter the discipline, or athletes in general, are not superheroes. There is a literal kryptonite to these athletes, whether you are Olympic caliber, junior college, overseas, it doesn't matter. Your kryptonite is life. Life happens. And I can only imagine the mental, no pun intended, the mental gymnastics she had to play, to undergo, dealing with USA Gymnastics and the Larry Nassar situation, and even those that are involved internally, externally, third party, whatever have you. The pressures of being not only the face of your sport, but one of the faces of athletics in the world. The fact that you are still as successful as you are under the age of 25, your accomplishments come with so much more pressure. They come with so much more brevity, and they also come with even more accountability in what you want to do, right, in life. And then lastly, and certainly not least, the fact that in the setting in which you compete, it's team oriented. So you don't want to appear as if you're giving up on your team. You don't want to appear as if that you are, just shunning your coaches, your athletic trainers, and, any other support staff, and your family, and those that you consider and deem close to you. I personally, applauded, Simone Biles for her situation and the way she handled it. And I know we've had on, a handful of, Zoom calls, we talked about the importance of your mental health. And for somebody to pick it, I don't want to ramble, right? But I don't like the fact that there's this assumption that, of course, she picks the biggest platform of her life to say, I'm not feeling it. It's deeper than that.
I think it's actually, that's the thing. I don't know if it's really a measured approach in the sense of, and I'm not saying that you're saying that at all. I don't know if it's a measured approach in terms of picking, quote unquote, the biggest platform. I think, I think the timing of it was just kind of what it was in general. I think it's everything in her life kind of compounded to the point where she needed to take a step back. And I think she did something that a lot of people to this day still in athletics don't feel comfortable doing, which is there's almost this pressure to have this hero complex, to think, well, I am a superstar athlete. I have to kind of like be the exception to the way the rest of society works, and I have to be above all of that. And I think a lot of athletes burn themselves out because they feel that unnecessary pressure to really kind of just shoulder the load and power through it. And then when they have the time out of the public light, finally address it. And I think it's something where we should be applauding her absolutely for what she's done, because it's to me, in a way, it's actually very selfless to do what she did, because she is prioritizing her mental health, which has its effect on the rest of the team. It shows that it's okay to be a human being. It's okay to be vulnerable. It's okay to address that. It's okay to recognize that, sure, I might be one of the most famous Olympians on the planet, one of the most decorated Olympic athletes of all time, maybe the most decorated gymnast ever. But at the end of the day, I still bleed the same way you do. I still have the same types of thoughts that you do. I still, at the end of the day, have anxiety. I have adversity to face, pressures, and I don't get to escape that. I go home, and that still is something that I have to deal with. And so, to be able to kind of say, yeah, I get that it's the Olympics. I understand that it's really important, and this is the biggest platform. And if there were ever a time to power through, it's now. And still say, you know what, I can't, because I'm a human being, and it's not fair to me or to anyone else here. I think it's one of the bravest things I've ever seen someone do, and people can disagree all they want and say, oh, how is it brave, Ethan, if she's not competing? I think it's more of a statement to go ahead and say, listen, there are things that are bigger than athletics, and to actually be able to make that stand at the Olympics. There are people that train their whole lives just for a shot at one. And the fact is that she still willingly is withdrawn from competitions, just basically make a point and say, like, listen, at the end of the day, like, sports are just one aspect of my life as a human being. But I'm so much more than that. We're all so much more than that.
Yes. And I want to like kind of the way we segue into this, I also want to like, kind of get deeper into this with something you said. And it's the buckle down and power through. Again, I don't think people understand that when it comes to athletes, again, it doesn't matter the discipline or the level. Asking them to buckle down and power through without reprieve behind it is almost impossible for somebody to do consistently. We, as just your ordinary humans, right? The ones that we're technically media since we have our own podcast, that's just the definition. When this podcast is done, we go back to doing whatever we wanted to do. We have that reprieve. We have that hiatus. We have that space to recoup, right? Why is it that for the simplest of not even demands, just the simplest of asks, could you respect my time? Could you respect my privacy? I need this for myself. And in the same, lane, whenever something big happens for us as just ordinary humans, right? There are those big moments where sometimes we feel the pressure, and it's not that we can't handle it. There are so many other things that are in the way right now that if I'm not my best self to try to provide, to try to, in this case, quote unquote, entertain or put forth my best performance, then I'm going to be shunned even more or vilified even more for ill performance. And then if I come back on the back end and say, well, this is what's going on in my life. Well, why didn't you compartmentalize? Well, why didn't you do X? Why didn't you do Y? Well, compartmentalization is just like a box that's over full, right? Like it's going to bust at some point. And again, you're talking about somebody who in the last 2 years dealt with the judging and the sentencing of a very notorious sports medical physician in the sport. The fact that I don't think people realize this, if they do research, Simone Biles wasn't that far after the whole Gabby Douglas era, who we crown arguably as the greatest gymnast of all time. So she walks into now what that new expectation is, completely shatters it, and is now in the new age of mental health, the new age of self-advocacy and the advancement of said advocacy. It's literally telling you, I don't have it. I've been trying to communicate this the best way possible. All I want you guys to do is understand that this is how I feel. Again, we're not asking, at least me and you, we're not asking these athletes to be 100% all the time. It's impossible. Because remember, me and you in our age group, in our generation, we went to school with certain people that may have been athletes at the next level, and we're like, oh wow, shock and awe. This person's going here, this person's going here, doing this, right? With something that has
shout out Bradley Roby in my comm class.
Exactly. You know what I'm saying? Like we had class with some of these people, and I always wanted to know, like deep down inside, what happens when you don't make that play? What happens when you have to miss a game or a match or a meet or an event? What happens when you are competing and you're just not at your best? What are you suppressing? What are you hiding? What is the real, issue as to why you're not moving as fast? You're not jumping as high. You're not thinking as critically. I ask myself those same questions because as somebody who had diagnosed performance anxiety, those are the questions that were asked for me. What am I doing when I feel like the studying, the material is too much? What am I doing when I get stifled on a question? Like, what are my thought processes? How am I breaking this down to make it simpler? It's everything can be related to the pressures of an Olympic, caliber athlete. What do you do when you have a bad practice? Or let's just take the sports side of it, right? What do you do if you're an athlete and you go through a bad breakup? What do you do when there's something going on with your family or your friends? Like, what do you do when there's something that may be minuscule to other people, but is that dearly important to you that you have to miss?
I think part of the issue is that as much as mental health acceptance has permeated its way into mainstream culture now, I think to a certain extent, athletics is still kind of one of those areas where it hasn't really fully permeated just yet in terms of our viewpoint as spectators, as media. I think that there is more of an emphasis, at least within teams internally now, within individual sports, where maybe behind closed doors there's more focus and attention to it. I think behind closed doors there's an overwhelming acceptance of what Simone Biles has done. I think she's been nothing but embraced by her fellow gymnasts. And I think her coaches and team members and doctors have said nothing but positive things about her decision. It's what the rest of the world, it's what the media, it's what spectators have reacted to, and how they've reacted. That really speaks volumes about it, because at the end of the day, I think that's one area where, yes, there's a general trend in a shift in philosophical viewpoint, but it's not across the entire spectrum just yet, and it's very glaring here because there still exists that grind, push through it, shoulder the load, you know, grit and bear it type mentality that does unfortunately rear its ugly head in sports media. And I think,
Yeah.
yes, there's definitely more attention put on it internally within organizations. I do believe that teams have, you know, I mean, the prevalence of sports psychologists. A lot of teams will employ people actually to address that. You have team therapists that are pretty common across
Yeah.
sports now, and so internally organizations are addressing mental health, or at the very least, they're taking steps to move in that direction. But at the end of the day, you still have people on talking point shows, people on ESPN, FS1, NFL Network, MLB TV, whatever sports network. And I'm not going to single out any individuals, because the fact is that this isn't supposed to be a call out. But I think, and I don't think it's something we're purposely doing it, but I think it's an absent-minded thing where we don't really think about it when we talk about what these athletes go through, or why someone might be performing a certain way. We don't really give it any second thought to any sort of off the field effects, any sort of conditions that may be underlying. We just think, why aren't they performing, or what's wrong with them? But we think of it in general, and we don't really kind of try to humanize the situation. And I think a lot of it is because we still do view them as these superhumans. And that's the overarching problem here, is that we need to stop putting them on such a high pedestal, because they are human beings. But
Yes.
it does, and I feel like I'm going in circles on this one. But at the end of the day, I think part of it is just going to be, as a society, really being able to hammer it in. And I think it starts with the media, and really finally starting to actually like address spectators, and really kind of like try to educate the audience and say, like, listen, at the end of the day, these are just human beings. And I don't know what it's going to take. Maybe some after school special type stuff, or like a PSA by one of these, but
I don't know.
someone needs to come out and speak on behalf of the athletes and say, like, listen, because the athletes are going to try and say it themselves and advocate for themselves, but we're not going to listen, unfortunately. Someone needs to speak out on behalf of them, whether it's the organization themselves, the entire sport, whether it's the NFL, NBA, Major League Baseball, MLS, NHL, whatever you have it, or ESPN, or one of these big broadcasting companies. But somebody has to, and I think it's more than just one person, but there has to be an overarching effort from the media perspective, or someone who's not an athlete themselves, to remind people, hey, listen, at the end of the day, yes, they're there for your entertainment, but at the end of the day, my God, they're still people, and they have their limitations. And yes, they do their best to do what they do what they love, and put on a show for you
Mhm.
guys. But come on, man. If the roles were reversed, do you really think it'd be fair if somebody was like expecting you to be able to be 100% yourself all the time, or
And that's
at a
my
moment's
problem.
notice?
That's my problem is there are people who do say, like, if the shoe was on the other foot, I would buckle down and power through.
That's
It's not that easy. It's not that simple either.
yeah.
Because if it was easy just to walk a mile in somebody else's shoes, we would all be able to do it, right?
Mm-hmm.
And I don't necessarily agree with the point that there should be a spokesperson for the athletes about, mental health struggles and, what they go through. I think each one stepping up and advocating for themselves is the exact coincidence that needs to happen. I stumbled upon something on Twitter a couple days ago. I had never heard of this guy before, Charlie Kirk, and he had a, a soundbite from something that he was talking about in the Simone Biles situation, that we are raising, a bunch of Simone Biles, in this generation. I know I definitely messed that quote up, but it brought me back to not just the mental health aspect of things, but also the physical health that takes a toll too, from the mental instability and, drainage that comes from what you're doing. With Andrew Luck and what Doug Gottlieb said about Andrew Luck, and the fact that the Colts didn't do right by Andrew Luck with the poorest offensive line that they had while he was there. And granted, Andrew Luck is a very physical quarterback. He likes to get out there and run, lower his shoulder. But for just the simple, pocket protection and, the ability to deliver a ball, at any given moment, with the time allotted, by his offensive line, he took a lot of hits, which required him to go through a lot of injuries. And they're not your typical 1 week, 2 week, 3 week, even maybe your every so often 4 week injury. We're talking surgery, setback, not even coming to the practice facility until surgery is over, rehab, and, getting back into the swing of things again multiple times in his career. Again, I worked with student athletes for a period of time, and I've seen some of those injuries take place. And the psyche behind the first one, okay, this happened. Let's hammer it out. The second one, the third one, the fourth one, you don't your mental health elasticity doesn't bounce back the way that it would after the first one. And to call a man or to call anybody soft for walking away from the game because they can't push through the rigors of not only rehab but coming back into the resetting of the process of becoming that franchise player, or any player of any stature on the team,
Well, Nick,
is disrespectful.
it goes even further too. Like, the fact is that I'm glad you brought up Andrew Luck. It's in his case, it's also the fear in the back of your mind, knowing each time you go out there, because of what was happening year after year, thinking to yourself, I'm realistically at an increased chance of having to go through this crap all
Like,
over again. Like, they
yes.
they they didn't do anything significant to improve this offensive line, and so in his mind, he's thinking he has to go into every single drive thinking one hit, and there's a good chance it's going to come at some point during this game. One hit is going to reset this whole thing, and I got to do the whole song and dance of rehab again. And I don't know if I'm going to come back the same player, or if I'm going to come back with any sort of semblance of the same amount of ability. And it's going to be uncertainty again. And how long does this repeat itself? And you always have that in the back of your mind, too. And it built up so much with him that at the end of the day, it affected his quality of life in the NFL. At the end of the day, I don't believe the guy retired only because, and we know he didn't retire only because of injuries. He retired because he genuinely didn't love the game anymore. And
He didn't have it.
how could you love a game that's that's literally killing you? And it's because, unfortunately, the situation within your own franchise doesn't appear to be in any sort of improvement long term. You have no
No.
reason to expect it's going to get better.
Yeah, making millions of dollars doesn't not the band-aid to that issue, right? And just for a little bit of insight, I don't want to get too personal on this, but I went through 4 months of rehab on my left knee sometime back in, I think it was like 2014. And it was more of a structural issue that I had that was just prolonged because of other issues with growing. And it just kind of caught up to me at that time. And there were some activities through basketball that I could do, but I actually couldn't play. And that hurt. Again, ordinary human, play sports all my life, ordinary human. My physical therapist said, no, at least for the first 6 weeks, no. You can go to the gym. There are certain drills that you can simulate with your rehabilitation and your plan that we have drawn up for you, but you can't play. So the amount of refusal I had to give my friends that I can't play, like I have this going on. And even may not even be my friends, but people that I was, cool with, that had my phone number, that, hey, we're going up to the art pack, or the ARC to go play basketball. Those are recreational facilities at Ohio State, for those that don't know. It's like, no, I can't. I have this going on. And the daunting aspect of the physical therapy for me, and just to kind of magnify it, is multiple days a week at 7 a.m. So I'm starting my day at 5:30, 5:45 a.m., waking up. And again, I don't have a car, and the campus of Ohio State is huge. So timing the bus to get there, right? Make sure I'm there on time. I still have class. I still have other stuff that I want to do throughout the day, but I know that there's something missing. Like there's something from an activity standpoint that I want to do that I can't do. So on a relative scale to Andrew Luck, you're spending all of this time rehabbing, right? Going through the emotional bout, the mental bout of rehab, because these are not short rehabilitation processes. They're still everyday things this man wants to do. Might want to go fishing. I want to walk around with my friends that are in town. I want to go visit my family. I want to go paint or put together this thing that I bought, but because my shoulder is still out of place, because my ribs and my kidneys are still in ill repair, that there's certain activities I can't participate in because I'm trying to just get my body back together for that, let alone for the $1 million contract that I signed to perform. It's not always about the money. It's not always about the performance. It's about the everyday thing. Like, and not to elongate this, but the first 6 to 8 weeks, no joke, of my physical therapy, I learned how to walk up the steps properly. That is such a breakdown of the incipient stages of how somebody walks that offended me. That offended me for 2 straight months. And I'm thinking to myself, these athletes have to rush that process to get back out on the field, to get back out on the court, to get on the vault, to get, in the pool. I credit all athletes that have stepped up in this process, because I don't know how you have it. I really don't. Again, I'm considered ordinary. You're considered the superhero. I know you're a regular human being at the end of the day, but I'm here to let those know, especially, we have listeners of this, particular population. I hear you. I'm listening. I'm backing you up on this.
Absolutely. You have an ally in both of us in this. The fact is that it's they're human, man. They're human. That's the overarching message of all this. If we can sum it up and put a bow on it, it's they're human. They're not gods, they're not immortals. Yes, comparative to the rest of us, sure, they've got superhuman type athletic ability, but human is still the second part of superhuman, the word. And we really need to start emphasizing that a little bit more. And just to, if I can cycle back real quick, to your point, I think there might have been like a slight misconception. I don't think that there necessarily needs to be like a spokesperson like on behalf, like an official spokesperson necessarily, but I think someone needs to speak out in conjunction with these athletes. I absolutely do believe they need to advocate for themselves. I think it's the best thing you can do is to speak for yourself, but I think someone needs to have their back as well. I think there needs to be unison, like a unity in this whole
Yeah.
endeavor. And I think it makes a very powerful statement if all athletes or most athletes do stand up, but it's even further statement if the franchises or the organizations or even the entire sport itself comes back and says, we stand by our athletes and this is a
Mhm.
problem. And I think that would, because here's the thing, what happened with you remember with everything with the with kneeling with the flag, right? um
Yes.
I think it would have been really powerful if every single sporting organization, the NFL took some time to make its stance known on that, but the NBA and Major League Baseball especially, Major League Baseball was very slow to the party with this one. Major League Baseball really, if they wanted to, could have said, "We stand with our athletes, we stand with our players, and we stand with our players by saying it's okay to kneel." If they had come out sooner and had a unifying message, basically said anyone who has an issue with social reform or with injustice in this country, we stand by you and we stand by your protests, it would have been such a powerful message to have that unifying call. In the same way that if the United States Gymnastics Association immediately came back and said, not only do we support Simone Biles, but we support any decision by any of our athletes to prioritize their mental health immediately, that's huge. That means that it's not just one athlete speaking on behalf of everyone. It's the whole sport unified in this cause. And I think the two should go hand in hand. I do agree that it should start with the athletes themselves, but I do think it's very powerful if you can get an organizing body or an organization or even the collective of an entire sport to get behind what you're saying in
Well,
unison.
speaking of collective bodies and organizations,
Yes,
leads
great
us to our
segue.
next topic, one of little lighter, because we don't want to diminish, mental health. We're not diminishing that by any means with the segue that we have. These just happen to be some of the biggest topics that are out there right now. Texas and Oklahoma
I was gonna lead
leaving the.
with I was gonna lead with, hey, any college football fans remember what happened with the Southwest Conference and the Big Eight? Are you ready for
Oh
history to
boy.
repeat itself?
Oh man.
Because
This
I'll
is
be
the peace
honest.
treaty. This is the copy of the peace treaty.
I'll be honest. The one person I do not envy in all of college sports right now is Bob Bowlesby. I I don't know how the hell he's keeping that conference together. Because the thing is that, like, you saw what their tact was, right? And this is the hilarious part. They went and then issued a statement where they wanted to, like, go after ESPN for trying to cause all this, to basically, I think they were saying that ESPN and other like reporting organizations were trying to create propaganda and have other, like, athletic conferences like the American Athletic Conference try to poach its members away, which is just, that's the last act of a desperate man. And
Yeah.
we're not even a month into this news and they're already doing that. And it terrifies me, because the thing is that if one of the P5 collapses, it's only a matter of time before we're in a point where I think we're dealing with super conferences, where you essentially are going to either do away with this whole P5 G5 thing, or we're flat out just not going to have conferences anymore. And I don't think it's going to get to that extreme. I think we are going to have conferences still. I can't see there being a conferenceless FBS, but I do think you're heading towards a situation where you're going to have regionals now, where you're essentially going to have a north, south, east, and west regional. And maybe it comes with rebranding from each of these conferences. I'm not sure how it goes, but I really think at this point, this is the first domino that really falls in that plan, because
Yeah.
I don't see how any of the other conferences are going to be okay with trying to play catch up. I think what's going to happen is that you're going to see more and more of these major conferences start to pick off members of the remaining Big 12. And then on top of that, I think it's only a matter of time before you start to see the strongest members of these G5 conferences pilfered over time, where we're going to see essentially 4 major regions, and I don't think you're going to have as many conferences anymore, or the traditional conference alignment as it is. But Nick, if I can, there's 2 reasonable outcomes for what's going to happen in the fallout of this, regardless of what the timeline is for OU and Texas.
So let me interject before you get there.
Uh-huh.
So it's already known that the NCAA football championship caters to the FCS and the playoff format, right? And what they have. The college football playoff is the college football playoff itself.
Right. It's not sanctioned. Well, it's not an official NCAA tournament. It's its own independent thing.
It's its own thing, right?
Mm-hmm.
So that was the first domino that actually fell. This just happens to be the second domino. And you're thinking it's just 2 teams leaving the Big 12. No, not 2 teams, not 2 schools, not 2 programs, 2 brands. When you know Boomer Sooner, you know the Longhorns, like you can name notable players. Exactly, you can name notable players from both of these programs. I met somebody one time, and I remember they talked about the NFL versus the NCAA. And why is it that NFL teams can't sell out college football stadiums, but college football teams could sell out an NFL stadium just like that? And my professor at the time, she had said, look, when you think about the landscape of football as a whole, while the popularity increases at each level, the actual fanfare diminishes a little bit. So Friday Night Lights in football. If you grew up, it doesn't matter if your football town is in the middle of Wyoming, you're going to sell out that night to watch your team play. Same thing with college football. You have literal stadiums that have 60, 70,000 people, right?
Or in our case, 110.
Give or take, if we're playing Bowling Green State or hosting Oklahoma, right? Which happened.
Yeah.
You have these stadiums. Let's go to a school like, I don't know, Northwestern. Mm-hmm. The night game in 2013 where they hosted Ohio State. I can imagine that within that stadium, they probably hold 65, 70,000 people. And for that game alone, probably had an equal amount of tailgaters. So tailgating in the NFL is a totally different experience. With that being said, understanding that 2 brands are moving to arguably the most hyped, most popular conference in all of college sport is only going to enhance so much. And it's not saying it's going to enhance it so much that it's going to be diminished. There is no diminishing factor that's coming from Texas and Oklahoma joining the SEC. There's none.
Can I counter that real quick? So I think it's good for the for increasing the hype behind both schools. I think it's good for increasing the hype behind the conference itself. I do think there are repercussions. I think to a certain extent, for people who are fans of the old guard, you're going to see that go away at a relatively accelerated timeline, which is fine. College football has gone through changes over the years. It is what it is. I'm someone of the frame of mind, and I'm sure you are too, where, tradition is one thing, but at the same time, being able to adapt is also a positive. And the fact is that no sport ever avoids undergoing changes over time. To your point about the first domino to fall, that it's not NCAA, that it's not technically NCAA sanctioned. It actually has never been technically, because there's no playoff structure and there never has been. So that's always been the case when it comes to FBS football. But aside from that point, I do think that there is one repercussion that is going to be felt, and that's just simply the fact that I I'm hang on one second. I have to attend to something. Nick, real quick, if you can make your point about the about OU and Texas in terms of if are there any more positives that you see from this, real quick, in terms
Oh,
of them joining?
yes. Yes. So most of these schools, especially in the SEC, do not, they have around 22 sports or less. So when you talk about revenue sharing after the end of every fiscal year, it's not spread out as thin like your University of Virginia's, your Ohio States, and your Stanfords that have 36 sports, right? Number two, there's a bolstering of certain sports in the SEC. While it's very evident that SEC women's basketball from a power standpoint is stronger than men's SEC basketball. Adding Texas and Oklahoma instantly increases the competition on the men's side in basketball right then and there. Football, it's a no-brainer. It's a no-brainer.
No, I
Let's talk about your non-revenue sports. I have mentioned this to somebody, and I'm looking at the text message right now. The sports that could have more programs break even potentially. This is just a hypothetical, and not count against revenue loss after revenue is shared to pay for, operational costs. Softball, first and foremost. Texas and Oklahoma are consistently in the Women's College World Series and even in the College World Series for the men's side, right? Because baseball is the second sport. And then the third sport, it's a bias, track and field. Texas, a premier track and field program. Oklahoma may not be as premier, but it's highly competitive. I have seen both of them represent at the national level with a handful of athletes, not only just getting there, but getting to finals and winning. With that, you have to also remember that Texas has its own network, the Longhorn Network, which is backed by ESPN. So what the Longhorn Network will be able to do from a media revenue standpoint is broadcast regional games. Texas versus Missouri is not going to be on ESPN1 or ESPN2. It may not even make ESPNU, but if it's on the Longhorn Network, it's going to get the airtime, right? Oklahoma is Oklahoma. Softball, I think football, I even think basketball when it comes to Oklahoma, right?
mm-hmm.
The operational budgets for these teams, I am curious to what those numbers look like. Now, I don't know the exact number of the exit fee for both of these teams, but the fact of the matter is they could make that money back within the first, I don't know, 2-3 years of joining the SEC, if not sooner, which is ridiculous. And I'm already thinking, ooh, what about the rematch between Texas and LSU? Because they did a home and home just a couple years ago, right?
Mm-hmm.
That's going to be a constant.
Right.
Oklahoma versus Alabama. They've met in the college football playoff. Well, that's going to be a constant.
Well, they're gonna have to figure out a realignment for that, because you have two teams that geographically would be the SEC West. So you have to figure out what's going to happen there. I think the thing I want to talk about, though, in terms of what could be a positive and what could be a negative. One positive is that if the Big 12 does somehow survive this, because of Texas's ridiculous percentage of revenue sharing in the conference, as well as Oklahoma's, I think if they invite two more people as replacement, or two more schools as replacements, you will see a more balanced revenue sharing across the conference. Texas essentially kind of bullied the rest of the members of the conference, Oklahoma included, in terms of getting the terms and conditions they wanted to, for a lot of things, but especially in terms of revenue sharing. The fact is that they were the only school initially that got their own TV network. Oklahoma got Boomer Sports network that started shortly after, but the rest of the 8 teams in that conference were kind of left to try and get a deal with ESPN for coverage, but they still didn't have an official network, so to speak. So I think that's a positive that can be highlighted if that conference survives. Or, if those schools get pilfered by other conferences, at the very least, they may get a better shake of things in those new conferences. But one thing I do think that may be a negative is you're going to see two historic blue blood programs that may struggle to maintain joining stronger conferences and having a stronger recruiting battle with someone like an Alabama or an LSU or an Auburn. and joining that conference, or Georgia or Florida, it's going to be interesting because you now have that interconference recruiting battle. And I get that recruiting battles do cross conferences, but in terms of recruiting, the effects it has on a program, you're going to feel them more now that you have to play those guys every single year. You're going to be feeling it more when essentially Texas, who is these days a 9-3 season or 10-2 season, is considered a plus for a program that essentially has been trying to rebuild for a while. I don't see how that school returns to form anytime soon joining a conference like this. And conversely, I think it may hurt everyone not named Alabama within that conference, simply because you now have added a perennial powerhouse in Oklahoma to the fold, who you have to play every year. You have Texas, who recruits well, who you have to play every year. And I think unless there's a reformatting of how you do the playoff, unless you expand the playoff, you're going to see a marquee program in Oklahoma or Alabama, one of those two, probably not making the playoff in any given year when they otherwise would have if they were separate. I think to a certain extent, having too many big time programs at the top of a conference and overloading it, you're going to see the ramifications unless there's an expansion of the playoff field. Because right now, if this actually
there will be.
I'm hoping so. I think that there's momentum on it, but I think it's not just going to be 8 teams. I think you may have to get down to 16 at a certain point when it comes to that, depending on how loaded these conferences get.
So I don't think – okay, so working behind the scenes of recruiting, I can tell you this right now. There are going to be teams in the SEC that might have to leave. And those two schools that pop up in my mind right now are Vanderbilt and Missouri. Vanderbilt, just because of athletics, competition varying across everything else, they're hit or miss. But they do have something to cater, right? Mm-hmm. And Missouri, that was already a bad idea for them to join anyway. But I'm going to say this, and understanding that I don't know everything, I know absolutely nothing. In the wise words of one of Kevin Hart's friends, most people don't know shit about boxing. I know nothing, okay? So I think Texas and Oklahoma, specifically thinking about Texas, they actually get better joining the SEC, especially from a football standpoint. I don't think other teams are hurt other than those who have 10-2, 11-1 seasons every so often. Your Ole Misses, your Mississippi States. Because now those 4-star athletes now have that outlet of 2 schools that they can go to, first and foremost, right? Secondly, from a geographical standpoint, when it comes to recruiting, you already have Texas A&M in that conference. You have 2 of the 4 biggest high school football recruiting battlegrounds already in the conference. You add Texas to the equation, everything opens up. Oklahoma, there are 2 schools. They have multiple schools that are good at football. There are 2 schools in particular, and they're rivals: Union High School and Jenks High School. I don't know if you guys watched the old MTV series where they used to see the best high school rivalries across the country, but those 2 high schools right there send kids to Oklahoma, Oklahoma State, Texas, Missouri, former Big 12 schools like Colorado, like Nebraska. All that's going to do is just keep what used to be an original battleground recruiting pipeline and bring it back. Texas will pilfer some of those recruits from Alabama, from LSU. I don't understanding how recruiting works it's like Einstein almost, right? But LSU, especially in their prime before the Joe Burrow era, where they were going 10-2, 11-1 every year, their best athletes, believe it or not, were from Houston, Texas. Working in the track and field landscape, some of LSU's best sprinters, men and women, were from Houston, Texas. What school is already in Houston? Houston. So if you're not keeping those kids in that particular area, they're going elsewhere, right?
Right, but
all this going to do is open up the pool.
Right, but I think the reason why Houston can't keep it is Houston's not in a major conference, and a lot of those top guys want to play for a national championship.
But even if they would have joined the Big 12, I don't think that anything would change. Like, okay, you like, let's say like Oklahoma State and Baylor, let's say, and Kansas, they all stay in the Big 12. And the Big 12 says, hey, we're going to bring in Houston and Cincinnati, maybe even Tulane. I don't know. I'm just throwing it out there. Okay.
I
I'm
would
just
I would
throwing it.
bring in UCF personally, but whatever.
I would bring in Boise State.
I would also bring, well, to me, the two options that I would bring would be UCF and Boise State. And then if you had
I
more
would bring
options,
in Houston and I would bring in
well,
Houston and
if you could bring,
Cincinnati as
but I'm
well.
saying if you could bring in four, if you bring in only two, my top two are Boise State and UCF. If I can bring
My
in
top two would be
four,
Boise State and Houston. I could debate Boise State and Houston being better than Boise State and University of Central
and
Florida.
that's fine. The point being is that if I had four, I would bring all four of those people in. They'd be my top four choices.
I'm agreeing with that. I am definitely
If
agreeing with that.
BYU didn't have serious Title IX issues happening there, I'd say they'd be a prime candidate for expansion.
But that's a different conversation for a different
No, it's
day.
a very different conversation, and one that's to me very black and white. Until they get their stuff together, no conference is going to open up its doors to them.
Well, we all know the one team that won't join a conference.
Well, what do you say?
At least for football.
I mean, if it's the one we're thinking of, then I would make the argument that maybe if Ohio State and Michigan weren't complete and total dicks about it, they probably would have already been a member of a conference.
I think they want their own money.
I think that there was actually, it's funny because if we look into the history of this, there was an attempt in the early 1900s to have Notre Dame join the Big Ten. And both Ohio State and Michigan said,
no. Nope. They wanted everything at the top. See, and that's why to the listeners and to the viewers that are going to see this is why me and Ethan have a love-hate relationship, because I do know what he's thinking. We think almost the same thing. We just have difference and radical points about it. But with this being a very central historical moment within college football, not athletics, just football, Notre Dame being added to any conference instantly increases the value of that said conference by a large sum. They could go 5-7. It doesn't matter. Notre Dame is in your conference.
I think we should kick out Nebraska and bring in Notre Dame. Nebraska can go back to the Big 12 and bring in Notre Dame. South Bend is literally at the center of the geographical Big Ten. It makes zero sense other than just simply it being more lucrative at this point for Notre Dame to be its own brand and independent. That's the only holdup, because geographically it makes way too much sense. And like, it's a clean split too. You have your Big Ten East and West. Nebraska's in the Big Ten West. What happens? They get kicked out. You bring in a Western team in Indiana, and you put them in there. And it really should not be that difficult. But whatever. Money in college athletics is a necessary evil, and it's unfortunately the main reason why a lot of stuff that we want to see doesn't get done. It's why it took so long for this conversation about playoff expansion to take place, because, as you know, bowl games are going to definitely not be happy that the emphasis on them is going to be de-emphasized. It's going to be decreased with an expanded playoff. Yeah. And the Rose Bowl may put a huge thorn in all of this if they decide that they can't move from their specific date and time. So we'll see about that. But that's a conversation, again, for another time.
I'll tell you what, if I'm a college football playoff, I'm working with the Rose Bowl. But
well, then you got to make them a permanent semifinalist. You got to make it's a rotation.
They would be fine with that. I think they would be fine with that.
It's literally okay. So you have the Rose Bowl and a rotation of the other 5 New Year's 6 games is basically being semifinal matchup games.
Look, it's the granddaddy of them all. You get with it or you get lost. But I want to throw something interesting out there with Texas and Oklahoma.
Mm-hmm.
Actually now having the okay and having other universities welcome them.
Mm-hmm.
The component of it being still student athletes and academically oriented, institutions. I'm trying to find the best way to put this. I couldn't find the message that I sent somebody where I asked this question. But when you think of why, you know what, and it wasn't academically centered. When you think of why certain people commit to certain schools, there's a big contingent of very talented players north of the Mason-Dixon line wanting to move south. And it has its properties. It really does. With Texas and Oklahoma joining the Big 12, potentially joining the Big 12, because I need to see something in writing that says this will be legit. It says July 2025. I need to see a formal signature. But with those two schools potentially joining the Big 12, and you're talking about recruiting, and even in the aspect of schools like Oregon that started the major facilities wars race, right? What do you see now in that aspect of recruiting to you? Maybe I'm asking somebody who may not know about recruiting as much. What do you see changing now with that? Because I remember when some of your traditional schools said, no, 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 I don't want a black jersey, and now they have them. What do you see? Because that's a big recruiting tool too, black or anthracite uniforms. What do you see now in the shift of recruiting that may have been evident already, but is going to be enhanced even more?
And
Mine were uniforms and facilities.
I think the shift in recruiting is going to come down to, I think one that we talked about before that I think doesn't get enough emphasis is the transfer portal. And I think to a certain extent, I think you could start to see programs that are not necessarily, and I'm not saying this is going to affect all G5 programs equally, but I think it's going to affect the top level of G5 programs, the ones that are ultra competitive within their own conference and actually have a chance of breaking through into the top 10 in the college football playoff rankings, like your Boise States, your UCFs, your Houstons,
Memphis.
And Memphis. Yeah. I'm sorry.
Can't forget about Memphis.
Yes. But the point being is that you have your teams each year that are the competitive ones there, and assuming this is assuming they stay put in their respective conferences. I think the use of the transfer portal basically with the recruiting, once you're talking about players that are already at the collegiate level, not necessarily ones that are looking at big name programs at a high school, but rather transfer portal, it becomes very appealing to a recruit. It becomes very appealing to a guy who may not otherwise start at another school, who is a former 4-star or 3-star. It may become very appealing if they can go transfer to a school and start for a team that's still going to have a decent amount of nationwide exposure and is going to essentially be able to start them, and be competitive. And I think the expansion of the transfer portal, and I think one thing that would be very key is if you could remove that provision that basically states that unless you have an exemption, you have to sit out a year. If we do away with that altogether, there becomes a ton of power in those programs. A program like a Boise State can gain a lot of momentum from something like that, because you might have, let's say, a safety who is going to be number 3 or 4 on the depth chart, or who may not actually even make the team at one school, but is still talented enough to play at another and still be one of the best players in that conference. Start looking at other options a little bit more and start thinking to themselves, well, I mean, I can play immediately, and I go there, and sure, I may not be a small fish in a big pond anymore, but I'll be a hell of a large fish in a small pond, and that may end up getting me drafted. It could be the difference between being drafted and being an afterthought.
That's the difference. I think I have one player. I don't want to hold the point up, but one player that came to mind was Jeremy Cash, safety who recruited to Ohio State, transferred to Duke, and had a hell of a career at Duke. I think it's the last 2 years of his career, if not just his senior year. I know his senior year for sure. He led his team in tackles as a safety and interceptions. Like, that's exactly the point you're making, and I think that's where recruiting gets a boost, right? That 3rd or 4th safety, that 3rd or 4th running back, if the Big 12 still survives this, that's at an Oklahoma or a Texas. It's like, you know what? Boise State has a very steady football program. Memphis has a very steady football program. Houston has a very steady football program and history.
And I mean, UCF has the entire Orlando area in terms of television exposure as well. So like
they have Orlando. Okay, so I visited UCF twice in my life, right? Once in 2011 when they were still kind of up and coming, but track and field was actually one of their probably their best sport. And then in 2018, after they beat, was it Auburn that they beat in the, I forget, like that was the year they claimed that they were the national champions. I remember that.
They beat Auburn in that one.
Beat Auburn. Dude, the buzz in that city was
and they are
Orlando Magic, UCF, and then everybody else.
They are national champions. They technically can claim one because they did get a major selector. The Massey Index actually is legitimately a major selector. But on that note, we do have to close out. We are running around that time, but I do appreciate you joining me today for this one. And I can't commit to the next one, but I'm hoping that there'll be more common moving forward, and we'll see. Maybe we can get another one going in a couple weeks, establish some sort of schedule. But just to give context to our viewers real quick, and this is kind of a last minute thing, but I want to plug my friend Nick's other podcast, dropping shortly, the Black in Sports podcast. And Nick has been preparing this one for a while. And Nick, just real quick as we close out, if you want to go ahead and just give a quick shout out to it, plug it.
Yeah. So the group Black, I helped co-found, sometime last year during the pandemic, actually in June. And, we talk about similar things that me and Ethan discussed, but it's more relative to the athletic administrator's experience and viewpoint, because that was where I come from and where, my experience lies in. A little bit more popular culture, a little more unfiltered as well. But, with the same, notion as me and Ethan in our podcast, it's another outlet of creativity for me. It's a very, huge catharsis in my life. And honestly speaking, I don't know where I would be without sports, whether you were an athlete or not. I know people that feel the same way. But yeah, you can follow me on Twitter at NicksTape15. You can follow the Twitter account for Black in Sports, BLAAC _ in sports on Twitter, and then no underscore for our Instagram page. And you can even add me as a friend on Facebook, Nick Graves. There's a C at the end of Nick, where I will be posting, the links to the podcast for Black, which is on Spotify and Anchor. But again, Ethan has been a huge supporter of the things that I do. I support Ethan in what he does. And again, just for a reiteration to our fans and, those people that listen, this was an idea that he contrived. I signed on probably in the same second that he mentioned it. And, this is something that we love to do. He went from more than a roommate to a friend, and a friend to somebody that I could have radical opinions about sports with. And we're here now. And I love it. I love Ethan to death. I do owe you a whooping in fantasy football, though. You got me last year. So I'm coming.
Hey man, at least you made the playoffs, dude. It's whatever. It's fine. It's fun. It's gonna start up soon, and I can't wait to crush all of you and end all of your dreams and win Kevin's league again, and then finally break through and win mine. But on that note, we are the Ethan and Nick's Trash Boat podcast team, and looking forward to getting this out there sooner rather than later, and getting back on track with these episodes again. I'm Ethan Finkelstein at I Am Finkelstein. He's Nick Graves at NicksTape15. And thank you for joining us, guys. Take care and prioritize your mental health, seriously.
Please, seriously.
See you guys.
All right.